Okay, let's move on to the fifth pillar. Okay, a very important concept that Nursi talks about is his emphasis on the essential difference between belief, Iman, and submission, Islam, and the interdependence of belief and submission for human salvation. So this is Nursi's discourse on Iman and Islam. So for Sayyid Nursi, external submission in the form of acts of obedience such as prayer, fasting, paying zakat, going on Hajj. For Nursi, these must be predicated on true, sustained, and constantly reaffirmed belief. Without belief, practice is worthless. For Nursi, without belief, practice is worthless. And belief has to be based on investigation, on introspection, on thinking, on deliberation, on contemplation. Without these things, Nursi says, belief cannot exist. And without belief, submission is worthless. So Iman, Islam. Islam has to be based on Iman. If Islam is not based on Iman, it's worthless. So however much you pray, however much you fast, it's worthless unless it's based on Iman. And Iman must be investigative. It must be based on evidences and investigation. It cannot be based on emulation. You cannot copy someone. You cannot follow someone blindly in issues of belief. As for belief itself, for Sayyid Nursi, belief is subject to increase and decrease. It can never be static. Iman can never be static. And he says, since man himself and the world in which he lives are being continuously renewed, he needs constantly to renew his belief. For in reality, each individual human being consists of many individuals. He may be considered as a different individual to the number of years of his life, or rather to the number of the days or even the hours of his life. For since a single individual is subject to time, he is like a model, and each passing day clothes him in the form of another individual. This is fascinating stuff. Nursi is saying that at every second you're a different person. You're not the same person that you were when you were 7 years old, or when you were 17 years old, or 27, or 37, or however old you are. We are constantly changing. And because we are constantly changing, and the world is constantly changing, and the cosmic book is constantly changing, and if you think about Ibda and Insha, from second to second to second, everything is changing, being refreshed and renewed constantly. We have to make a response to this. We have to read these signs which are being continuously renewed. And so belief can never be static. The verses are continuously being revealed to us. And so our response in the form of, do we believe, do we not believe? How do we read the creation? This must be continuously refreshed and renewed and revived.
Would you say Justin Welby's statement today is indicative of what he's just saying?
It's hugely problematic, isn't it? Do you want to tell us about the Archbishop of Canterbury today? He said something in the newspaper.
Yeah, he said, I'm not sure if I can believe in God. And he just woke up and just said, because of what's happening last week.
Yeah.
And he has to renew his belief, or his question his belief.
Yes, yeah, we cannot just assume that we're believers.
Right.
Belief has to be constantly, because we are being constantly tested. We're being constantly tested. So we cannot just assume that we are believers. Because tomorrow you're going to be a different person, with a different challenge. And your belief can go up and it can go down. You know, like those advertisements on television, you know, to borrow money or to invest money, and they say interest can go up or down, or repayments can go up or down. And our belief can go up and down. You can wake up in the morning with very strong belief, and by the evening you can be an unbeliever. Or the other way around. Even. So, we cannot take for granted that we are believers. We have to constantly work on our belief. Now, belief should lead to submission. Iman should lead to Islam. Because Iman conceptually precedes Islam. But not every believer in God will necessarily express submission to God's will in the form of rite and ritual, such as prayer and fasting. So Iman doesn't necessarily lead to submission. And Nursi talks about some individuals as non-submitting believers. Mu'min gairu Muslim, I think. Non-submitting believers. So there are some people who say, yes, we believe in God, we believe in divine unity, we believe in prophethood, we believe in the next world, we believe in the hereafter, but they don't pray, possibly, or they don't fast. So they have the belief component, but not the submission component. And then Nursi says that by the same token, we can't say that everyone who practices is necessarily a believer. And in fact, in the Quran, it tells us on numerous occasions that some people submit to God without any inner conviction. Which means that while it's, we're encouraged to assume that prayer and fasting and Hajj are the hallmarks of belief, they're not necessarily indicative of belief. And there is a famous verse, and I can't remember the number of the verse. It's about the Banu Asad. And it says, the Bedouins say, we have believed. Say, you have not yet believed, but say instead, we have submitted. For faith has not yet entered your hearts. So there was a tribe who came to the Prophet and said, we're believers, we believe. And he said, no, you haven't believed yet. You may have submitted, but you haven't believed yet. So this is pointing to the possibility that our Islam may not have a really firm basis of Iman beneath it. And this is why he focuses on the need to recreate and, to refresh and to revive and to renew our belief constantly. Because belief can go up and down. But Islam is the same, you know, fasting is the same. Prayer is the same. It doesn't change. But the belief which is supposed to be behind it can change. So the fact that you pray and the fact that you fast are no guarantee that you are a believer, as this response in the Quran shows. And so when Nursi talks about the unbelieving Muslim, presumably this is what he's talking about. This is what he's referring to. I'll stop it there for 2 minutes. And it's quite warm in this room. People are sort of...
Dozing off.
Do we have any comments or observations about Iman and Islam so far? No? Okay, we carry on. So we've talked about Iman and Islam. There also appears to be two kinds of Islam. Two kinds of submission. A kind of formal submission and a kind of internal submission. And the formal submission, I would say, is Islam with a capital I. Islam with a capital I. Or Muslim with a capital M. And that means, for example, your parents were Muslim and you are also Muslim because your parents were Muslim. And because you were born in a part of the world which happened to be Muslim, your religion is also Islam with a capital I.
I think as far as I can remember one ayah from the Quran where it said...
You have to speak up a bit more clearly.
There is a one ayah where it says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, aminu.
Yes.
Thanks to this sort of
Yeah, it fits in here, yes. Those, you who believe, believe, yeah. So there are two kinds of Islam. A formal Islam, or I call it an ID card Islam. You're Muslim because you happen to have been born in Iraq. If you'd been born in Israel, you'd be a Jew. If you'd been born in Britain, you would be a Christian. So it's geographical Islam. ID card Islam. And then there is a true internal Islam, which is the Islam of internal submission, which is Islam with a small I. Islam with a small I, Muslim with a small M. So we can have Muslims who are not actually Muslim. We can have Muslims who are not actually Muslim. Muslims with a capital M, who are not actually Muslim with a small m. So we can have believers who are not Muslims. And we can have Muslims who are not Muslim. We have to consider where do we fit in. Yeah? Nursi is also very clear on the need for both components to be present as the criteria for salvation. You have to have Iman and Islam for salvation. So if you have Iman and no Islam, then you cannot consider yourself saved. If you have Islam but no Iman, you cannot consider yourself saved. There has to be both. So the belief that external submission, the belief that there has to be belief and external submission is what Nursi is saying. And for belief to exist without external submission is unacceptable. Also, submission without belief is unacceptable. And Nursi criticizes those who follow blindly. He says belief has to be through investigation. You cannot say you are a believer because your parent was a believer. You cannot say you are a believer because in your country they are Muslims, so I am a believer. Belief has to be through investigation. Through tahqiq, rather than taqleed. I'm presuming we all understand these words. So, belief without submission, submission without belief, these are self-defeating, leading ultimately to the gradual disappearance of belief. So, Why is this important? Why is Nursi so insistent on this? Well, I think that the importance of Nursi's discourse on belief and submission lies in the fact that it reminds us not to be complacent. It reminds us not to be complacent. We cannot say, I'm a believer and that's it. Today you're a believer, what about tomorrow? There has to be constant investigation. There has to be constant dialogue between you and the book of the universe and the book of Revelation. These are all working hand in hand. We have to be constantly aware, constantly awake. This is Nursi's emphasis. Just because we're born into families who raised us as Muslims shouldn't lead us to think that we are believers by birth. There is no such concept as believer by birth. Muslim, yes. Muslim, capital M, possibly. But no one is a believer by birth, or by birthright. As I said, we may be Muslim, but we may not even believe. I know lots of Muslims who are Muslims with a capital M, but they're unbelievers. Some of them say we don't believe. Even if we are Muslims by geographical circumstance, belief comes from investigation, not from following blindly. So we may be Muslims by birth, but we have to become believers.
Does he make a categorization?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Categorization. I mean, like, for example, if I'm a poor guy, I don't have the capacity, and you know, I'm just a person who, you know,
Right.
I'm working in the farm. I mean, I don't have the intellectual faculties to go into the whole dynamics of questioning belief. And
You will still question. You are still a human being in creation.
right.
You still have a responsibility according to your ability.
According to your ability.
Yeah. So we may be Muslims by birth. Now, I wasn't a Muslim by birth. And people say to me, you know, how did you become Muslim, or when did you become Muslim? I turn it round, I turn the question round. And I say, when did you become Muslim? If a Muslim asks me. Because we all have to become Muslim. We all have to become mu'min. We all have to become believers, and we all have to become Muslim with a small m. There are 1 billion Muslims with a capital M. How many Muslims with small m? So once belief is attained, it doesn't remain static. And Dos Mehmet gave us the example there. O you who believe. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu aminu billah. Yeah, those of you who believe, believe in Allah. Why is God telling the believers to believe? Because belief is something which has to be maintained and renewed constantly. So Nursi's explanation of the dynamic nature of belief shows us that if belief is to be maintained and increased, it has to be worked at constantly. So that's all I want to say about belief and unbelief, or belief and Islam. It's a very important part of Risale, actually.